Chapter 7. In the 17th century, a man named Francis Pope had been one of the first owners of the land on which Washington, D.C. was now being built. He must have had a sense of humor, for he called his property Rome and named the little stream that ran through it the Tiber after the famous Roman river. All this was just so he could be addressed as the Pope of Rome on the Tiber. By the time the capital city was established, Mr. Francis Pope had, of course, been long dead, but the little Tiber was still there, running in swampy ground between the president's house and the Capitol. In time, the Tiber would be diverted, lose its name, and be replaced by what is now as Pennsylvania Avenue. Yet, when Jefferson took office, the city was still a sim wilderness, with some shacks and a few fine houses scattered through the woods. While most of its streets were still in the planning stage, President Jefferson did not in the least mind the disorderly scene of frantic construction that was going on all about him. Forever pulling down, putting up, and redesigning Monticello, he was used to living in cluttered and was excited to hammer excited to think that a whole city was being dug out, built up, and hammered together around him. Unlike John and Abigail Adams, who found the president's unfinished mansion, or palace as it was often called, cold and uncomfortable. Jefferson said it was very agreeable century residence. As president, he planted a double row of popular trees up swampy Pennsylvania Avenue and built a rough sheep fence around the mansion. Most important, Jefferson changed the style of life inside his mansion. No more sermonal folder folderol for him. No, 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 no. Weekly high toned receptions such as Washington and Adams had held, determined to put a Republican stamp on his admission administration. He shocked many people by refusing to act as a head of state, unattended by servants. He walked or rode horseback around town instead of riding in a carriage as all degenerates off did. When Senator or Congress called Jefferson, often, sometimes his hair wasn't even properly combed. Often his pet mockingbird was perched on his shoulder, looking over the company as if he expected to give his report on the meeting later. When it came to state dinners, Jefferson paid little attention to proper seating arrangements, letting ambassadors and their wives sit on any old place as if there were no rules for guests of honor. He made a lifelong enemy of Mrs. Mary and the wife of the British ambassador, and when he was asked what etique he followed, he answered pell mell. When the Madisons first arrived in Washington, they lived with Jefferson in the president's mansion. for a short time, and after the summer recess, they moved to blocks 2 blocks away into a 3-story brick house which boasted a cupola on its roof with a fire escape. The Madisons, however, did not feel the need to create quite a Republican image as Jefferson had, although James stuck to his usual black breeches with knee buckles and laced shoes. He had no objection to Dolly indulging in fancier tastes. And Dolly, freed from Quaker restrictions, had discovered shopping, whether she was buying furnishings for Jefferson's household or for her own, or clothes for Jefferson's 2 married daughters who visit from time to time, or clothes for herself. It didn't matter. She simply loved to shop. Deprived of pretty clothes for so long, she especially liked to buy stylish dresses, often with the help of the French minister's wife. Dolly became practically partial to the Empire style when it became fashionable. Low necked, high waisted, and sleeveless. Later, she would be known for her turbans, all kinds of turbans, satin, silk, plumed, flowered. She called them all. Indeed, over the years, she became so famous for high fashion that the first question women would ask after a Washington party was, "What did Mrs. Madison wear?" Yet it was not her clothes, but her warm personality that made Dolly popular. She carried herself like a queen, people said, yet she was so natural she created an atmosphere of ease, friendship, and lively conversation whenever she went. James, too, was more sociable than he'd been ever since his marriage. People noticed he had seemed more relaxed. He was quicker to laugh, and although he had always loved good stories, he told them more frequently now and then. And as everyone agreed, no one told a story better than he did. In short, Washington society would always count on a good time when invited to the Madisons' home. Only Mrs. Mary complained once after an ample dinner, which included beef, soup, cabbage, ham, and apple pie baked in the form of a mescamelon. Mrs. Mary grumbled. It was more like a harvest home dinner, she said, than what one would expect at the table of the Secretary of State. When Dolly heard this, she laughed. "Why not?" she said. "The country had an abundance of food. Why hold back?" But of course, it was not only Republicans' style, but Republican politics that was on trial. Jefferson, Madison, and the loyal Republican Congress wasted no time in letting the country see that they meant to put in practice what they had been preaching all these years. Congress did always with the internal taxes, cut down the national debt, and release all those outspoken Republicans who had been victims of Mrs. Adams' Sedition Act. Indeed, the main difficulties the country had faced had been forced on it by foreign wars. But if the country could keep free of entanglements. Jefferson and Madison hoped they would have a chance to make the Republican experiment work. At first, they were lucky. Right in the beginning of Jefferson's administration, November 1801, England and France made peace with each other. This did not mean, however, that all of Europe was at peace. Over the years, while France had been fighting first one country and then another, a general had emerged as a hero to French nation, Napoleon Bonaparte. Hot for conquest, established himself as head of the French government. And although England, tired of war, made peace with him, who knew what to expect with a man like Napoleon on the loose? But at least with England and France no longer at war, travel across the ocean should be safer. After all, freedom to trade was what Jefferson and Madison wanted above all else. Not only freedom on the Atlantic Ocean, but freedom on Mississippi River. Here, there could be trouble. What if Napoleon decided to interfere on the Mississippi River? He had a good chance to do this. Spain, which had become a vassal state of Napoleon's, had ceded the Louisiana Territory to France. So, if he wanted to, Napoleon could move right into New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River. That would be the end of all freedom of trade on the Mississippi River. Besides, who wanted a French colony planted in our own Western territory? If that happened, Jefferson said, America would have to do an unthinkable thing. It would have to ally itself with Great Britain. Only Great Britain had a navy strong enough to fight France. The very thought was scary. So Jefferson came up with the idea of trying to buy Louisiana from Napoleon. He didn't suppose he'd succeed, but just in case, Madison had, as Secretary of State, sent James Monroe and Robert R. Livingstone to France to try to negotiate a deal. As it happened, Napoleon wasn't nearly through conquering. He wasn't even through fighting Great Britain. That war was resumed in May 1803, but he was running short of money, and his army in Domingo was being ravaged by disease and defeat. So he was quite pleased with the idea of selling Louisiana. Of course, there was some bargaining, but in the end, Napoleon was happy and that he was getting $15 million for an out of the way piece of property that he never expected to see. And Americans were jubilant to hear that they had acquired not only New Orleans, but 828,000 square miles of territory at a cost of less than one penny an arc, and all without a war. Hmm. The news of the agreement arrived in Washington on the evening of July 3rd, 1803, just in time for the 4th of July guns went off at dawn the next morning, and President Jefferson threw the mansion open to the public, many of whom stayed all day and all night to celebrate. Indeed, all over the country, people continued to celebrate for months. Jefferson knew that to make the Louisiana Purchase entirely legal, he would have to introduce a constitutional amendment and then wait for the amendment to be passed by the states. But suppose Napoleon changed his mind in the meantime. Congress agreed that it couldn't take that chance. So on October 20th, 1803, it completed the agreement. In December, the stars and stripes were raised over New Orleans. Some Federalists, however, were not happy about the Louisiana Purchase. In New England, some feared that the Louisiana Purchase would give more power to the West and the South. The East would be overshadowed. Besides, they didn't like the way the Republicans were turning the country into what they called a vulgar democracy. They made fun of all the tough Western characters who would one day be coming into the Union. Thick skinned beasts will crowd Congress Hall. Josiah Quincy of Massachusetts grumbled, "Buffaloes from the head of the Missouri and alligators from the Red River." A few Federalist leaders in New England began talking secretly of seceding from the Union if they could find strength enough to support a separate government. In Virginia, John Randolph, a staunch Republican, also complained about the growth of the country. Only a small Republican could maintain its liberty. He said, but John was an eccentric man who was forever disapproving of something. As time went on, he would take Patrick Henry's place in James Madison's life. Although he never got under James's skin quite as much as Patrick had, still, John was a flaming orator with a flashy style and a shrill voice. And he hated Madison. He insisted that Madison had forsaken Republican ideals. With John Randolph, if something was not a total success, it was a total failure. No changes or compromises allowed. To show that he was still loyal to the original ideals of the party, Representative Randolph called himself an old Republican, and he was impossible to ignore. He would stride into Congress on his long, still stilt-like legs, cracking a riding whip, and following often as not by one of his hunting dogs, as if he were closing in for a kill. Later in the Madison administration, Dolly would attend a session of Congress. If Randolph was going to speak, it was like going to a show, she said. At the moment, however, no one worried about John Randolph or the Federalists breaking up the Union. Louisiana Purchase was generally so popular that Jefferson had no trouble being elected for a second term. Governor George Clinton of New York replaced Aaron Burr as vice president, and James Madison continued as Secretary of State. But it was hard to keep the nation on a steady course. Americans had once believed that the Atlantic Ocean was so wide it would keep the country safe from European conflict. But it didn't keep it didn't work out that way. With with England and France fighting each other, the Atlantic Ocean became the center of danger. Again, England was stopping American ships at sea and kidnapping American seamen under the pretense that they were disasters from the British Navy. It was intolerable, Americans said. Was an would England never accept the fact that United States was an independent nation, which each incident Madison and Jefferson protested? And at the same time, every seam Jefferson protested, and at the same time, every seam they could think of to get the British to sign an agreement to stop impressment, but the British would do no such thing. They needed a sailors. They needed sailors. And that was that. At one point, the British foreign minister observes that the idea that the American flag should protect every individual sailing under it on a merchant ship was too ridiculous even to consider. Madison and Jefferson could not go on simply protesting, yet they certainly did not want to go to war. The country was just getting on its feet. How would they risk the success of their whole experiment? So they played for time, hoping against hope that the European war would end before were dragged into it. But life never operated on just one level at a time. For Dolly Madison, one of the happiest and yet saddest events of these years occurred shortly before Jefferson was reelected as president. Her sister, Anne Payne, who had lived with her ever since Dolly's first husband, John Todd, died, was to be married to a Massachusetts congressman. The ceremony took place on March 20th, 1804, in the Madison's drawing room, with James Madison giving away the bride. Of course, Dolly revealed in all the shopping required for a wedding and in the festivals surrounding it. But it was hard to lose Anna. Indeed, in spite of her active social life, Dolly was, for a while, inconsolable. Anne was gone. James was so busy. He was out of the house much of the time, and Precious Payne was away at school. He was 12 years old now, more handsome than ever, and if he seemed selfish and irresponsible to others, Dolly paid no attention. How could her precious pain not turn out well? But the world turned too fast for Dolly to waste time feeling sorry for herself. Suddenly, the whole nation was shocked by news of a duel between two of its most prominent patriots, Aaron Burr, who had lost his run for governor of New York, blamed his defeat on Alexander Hamilton. It was not the first time he had been angry at Hamilton. He also claimed that Hamilton had been responsible for his defeat as president when he vote when the vote had been tied. Behind the scenes, Burr had been secretly plotting with a little group of rabid New England Federalists to try and draw New York into their secessionists scheme if he won this election as governor, but he did not win. And Alexander Hamilton, Federalist though he was, he no he had no use for secessionists talk and no use for Aaron Burr, a despicable person, he called him, a dangerous man. He didn't care if Burr heard what what he said or not, and Burr did hear and didn't like it. He challenged Hamilton to a duel. And although Hamilton didn't believe in dueling, he felt in all honor he had to accept the challenge. He apparently had not intention he he apparently had no intentions, however, of pulling on the trigger on his gun, no matter what the outcome. When the duelists met on July 11th, 1804, on the banks of the Hudson River in New Jersey, the outcome was just what Hamilton must have foreseen. While Hamilton held his fire, Burr did what he'd come to do. He shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. The outcry across the country among both former friends and former foes was unanimous and intense. Burr was called far worse names than any Hamilton had ever used. You have already heard, no doubt, of the terrible duel and poor Hamilton. Oh, Dolly wrote her sister Anne. She must have wondered how she had ever trusted the guardianship of her precious pain to Aaron Burr. In New York, in New Jersey, Burr was indicated for murder, so he dared not even step into the state. But he had no compunctions about returning to Washington, where he resumed his duties as vice president, as if nothing had happened. He knew that when Jefferson's term expired in March 1805, he would not be elected vice president again and would probably never be elected to a profile office. But there were other ways to acquire power. A dangerous man, Hamilton had called him, and already he may have been hatching dangerous plans. As Jefferson's second term progress, storms threatening on the horizon moved in, backed off, and moved in again. England simply would not leave American shipping alone. To justify its actions, England quoted an old rule which denied the right of natural nations to trade with colonies of her enemies. This would keep America out of the West Indies, a principal trading center. England herself, however, kept right on trading with her enemy colonies. So, where was the scene in it? Madison, a man who believed that rules would make sense, thought that perhaps he might persuade England to see how unreasonable the rule was. So he wrote a pamphlet filled with legal and historical arguments, a long, wordy essay, a copy of which he sent to England, and which he also gave to each United States senator. A few praised it, most found it boring. John Randolph threw it on the floor of the Senate, calling it a miserable card house of an argument which the first puff of wind must demolish. As for England, an anonymous writer claimed that everything Madison had said was wrong. Reason was not going to stop England from doing whatever it wanted to do. In the spring of 1806, three British warships raided American ships in Americans' own waters, killing one seaman, and in process, the president ordered the three ships to leave America and stay out of all American ports in the future. By 1807, at least two American ships were being seized every week. Then Napoleon declared a blockade of Great British Britain and began confiscating American ships and goods. Great British said it would take the same measures against natural shipping that France did. War was in the air, but in the midst of the difficulties, a plot was developed within the United States itself to break up the Union. In the spring of 1806, Jefferson and Madison began hearing rumors that Aaron Burr had been soliciting money for England, was building boats and gathering an army so that he could take New Orleans. Presumably, his purpose was to establish an independent state, perhaps attack Mexico, perhaps even draw the South states into a new nation. Madison and Jefferson were appalled at such rumors, but knew they had to wait for more evidence. It came to the following years. In spring of 1807, a fellow conspirator, commander of the U.S. Army in the Mississippi Valley, and governor of Upper Louisiana, decided that he'd do better telling on Burr than going along with him. The detail of what actually took place are still not entirely clear, but Jefferson had heard enough. He was going to catch the Aaron Burr who had wanted to cheat him out of the presidency and was trying not to break up the Union. In March, Burr was arrested on the Mississippi River and taken under guard to Richmond to be tried by Chief Justice Marshall. Because Marshall was a Federalist, many did not trust him to hold a fair trial, but fair or not, he ruled there was not enough evidence to prove that Burr was guilty. The rest of the country could believe what it wanted, but there was no proof, Marshall said. And Burr had been president at the time, and place the army was being assembled, or the army was gathering for the express purpose of making war. Without even hearing all the witnesses, Marshall let Ehrenberg go. And go he did, as fast as he could, to Europe. Meanwhile, England seemed to be actually inviting America to go to war. On June 22nd, on English ships, an English ship, the Leopard, followed the brand new American frigate, the Chesapeake, out of its home port, demanding to search the ship. The Leopard surely expected the Chesapeake to refuse, and of course it did. But the Chesapeake did not expect the Leopard to open fire. The result was that 3 Americans were killed, 18 wounded, and 4 seamen impressed. Only one of them whom was actually a British disaster. The Chesapeake had to strike her colors, which was a blow to American pride. But even worse, the Leopard turned around and anchored within sight of the Virginia coast. Just as if it were thumbing its nose at America, Jefferson immediately proclaimed that American waters were off limits for all British ships. He demanded the England apologize, that the captured seamen be returned, and that impressment end. The understanding was that if these conditions were not met, war would almost surely follow. Jefferson mobilized 100,000 military men to show that America meant business. But Great Britain was not easy scared by the United States. In December, George III, who had never recovered from losing his colonies, issued orders to continue imprisonment. Every natural vessel bound for Europe, he declared, most stop first in England for a license. France jumped on the bandwagon. Any natural vessel stopping first in England would be considered fair game for capture. There was only one alternative, Jefferson and Madison decided. America would keep its ships at home. Not only would this keep them out of danger, but surely England and France would back down once they began losing money as trade stopped. If reason didn't work, money might. So in December 1807, the United States passed the Embargo Act. No more trade with Europe. Madison knew that as a result of Embargo Act, Americans as well as Europeans would lose money, but if they went to war, they would lose a great deal more. Surely, Madison thought. Americans would understand this and would together, stick together. New Englanders were the hardest hit. Their ships lay at anshore, up and down the coast. Sailors loafed on the waterfronts. Fish rotted in fish houses, and maritime industries stood idle. And Federalists in New England were furious. Left along, their ships could at least have gone to Portugal or some other uninvolved country and then traded with England on the sly. They were willing to take their chances, but instead they were being traded like children. Was this the freedom they had fought for? They asked. Freedom of the government to reach into their pockets? A freedom to rob them of their livelihood? The Embargo Act was as arbitrary, they claimed, as anything England had done in the old days. Some even accused Jefferson, who had been such a friend to France, of wanting to help Napoleon by ruining American commerce. Some refused to obey the law, sneaked their ships out of hidden coves at night, and traded as usual. A few extremists, those who called themselves High Federalists, whispered that New England would always be discriminated against by the national government. Perhaps it should secede. People were not only tense about the Embargo Act, however, they were tense about the coming election. For a year before the actual election, they were arguing about who should be the next president. Although Vice President Clinton had a few supporters, he was generally considered at 16.8 to be too old. James Monroe had the enthusiastic endorsement of John Randolph and some of his friends, largely because Randolph could not bear the idea of Madison becoming president. If Madison were elected, Randolph predicted, "We are gone forever." Madison was criticized for being too weak, and he was criticized for being too strong. He was criticized for being a puppet of Jefferson, and he was criticized for being Jefferson's master. Yet in the end, people seem to agree that Madison would most likely be the next president. On March 1st, 1809, the Embargo Act, an obvious failure, was repealed and would officially become effective in March 15th. 2 weeks after inauguration, foreign armed ships, however, were still excluded from American ports, as well as English and French importers' goods. Still, if either England or France gave up its anti American policy at sea, they were told America would resume trade immediately. It was another temporary delaying tactic. If there was a solution, it could only be reached by the next administration. On December 7th, the election college cast its votes, but the results was not officially announced on the floor of the House of Representatives until late February. Spectators crowded into the gallery, waiting to hear the outcome. At the end of the 2 long hours, the President of the Senate announced that James Madison would be the new President of the United States. George Clinton be the new President of the United States. George Clinton would be the Vice President. Everyone knew that James Madison faced critical days ahead, perhaps even war. John Adams was one among many who believed that a second war with England was inevitable, and many wondered about Madison, described once as a schoolmaster dressed for a funeral. James didn't look like a leader, certainly not a war leader. Could this little man handle the big job he'd been given?